My girlfriend, though, she's genuinely like one of the best people I've ever met. She's really an amazing human, and I think that's because her mom's dead. You know, because that's what makes good people, is having to get through pain in life and get through it, you know? Her mom died when she was 12. She's 14 now.
Good morning. It's Saturday, June the 1st, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for patriots, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, and the 33 strategies of war. All that and more when I get back.
God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
You may run on for a long time, run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Let me tell you, God might be gonna cut you down. You may run on for a long time, may run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Let me tell you, God might be gonna cut you down. Go tell that long-term liar, well, go tell that midnight rider, well, tell the gambler, the rattler, backbiter, tell the God might be gonna cut him down. Well, stop, God Almighty, let me tell you the news. My head's been wet with the midnight dew. I've been down on my bended knee, talking with the man from Galilee. My God spoke and he spoke so sweet. I thought I heard the shuffle of angels' feet. He put one hand upon my head. Great God Almighty, let me tell you what he said. Go tell that long-term liar, well, go tell that midnight rider, well, tell the gambler, the rattler, backbiter, tell the God Almighty gonna cut him down. You may run on for a long time, may run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Let me tell you, God Almighty's gonna cut you down. You may throw your rocks and hide your hand, plotting in the dark against your fellow man. But sure as God made the day and night, what's done in the dark will be brought to the light. You can run and hide, slip and slide, talk about the mote in your neighbor's eye. But sure as God made the rich and poor, you're going to reap just what you sow. You can run for a long time, may run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Let me tell you, God Almighty's gonna cut you down. Go tell that long-term liar, go tell that midnight rider, tell the gambler, the rattler, backbiter, tell the God Almighty's gonna cut him down. Some brothers go to church just to signify, trying to make a date with the neighbor's wife. But brother, let me tell you, sure you're born, you better leave that woman alone, because one of these days, you mark my word, you think that brother has gone to work, you're going to creep up and knock on his door. That's all, brother, you'll not no more. You can run for a long time, may run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Let me tell you, God Almighty's gonna cut you down. Go tell that long-term liar, well, go tell that midnight rider, tell the gambler, the rattler, backbiter, tell the God Almighty's gonna cut him down.
Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
The farmer and manufacturer can no more live without profit than the laborer without wages. David Ricardo. It is a good thing that we do not look at the worker who demands to be paid for his work and decry him or her as greedy. But when we decry the business owner for pursuing profits, are we not doing the exact same thing? Profits are to the entrepreneur what wages are to the worker. Now, there are some who would say, allow the entrepreneur to profit, just not too much. Besides the obvious Phariseeism of this thought process, it also invites tyranny, subjectivity, disincentives, and distortions. Incomes are a noble thing, whether they be received by a worker or an owner, and called profits.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
But you need to do more. You need to continue to get out there, and more than ever before, actively support those books, movies, TV shows, and publications that reflect your values. Make a point of it. Open your checkbooks if you have to. How the heck do you think we've kept magazines nobody reads, like The Nation and the New York Review of Books, alive all these years? We just get one of our friendly, capitalism-hating, social progressive zillionaires to cough up some dough, and we're good for another 10 years or so. One other thing. Remember who your friends are. That's a problem we stalwart men and chicks of the left often have. Although we joke about it a lot, circular firing squads, and Will Rogers' hoary old chestnut of not belonging to any organized political party on account of he was a Democrat. You shouldn't fall prey to such internecine warfare. After all, you don't want to take over the world. You just want to finish your shift at the plant and go home to live in peace. So use all these new media platforms your kids are down there in the basement inventing at this very minute, and plug your buddies. Make us know their names. We ain't gonna like it, but the louder we scream, the greater effect you'll be having. Especially if we start yelling about the unfairness of it all. America, you fools, has always been conservative, in the worst sense of the word. Conservative of the ancient values of Western civilization, of the legacy of Milton and Locke and Hume and Bishop Berkeley and even Hobbes. That's the truth, so start acting like you believe it. And stop having your kids studying animal husbandry or whatever it is they study at their loser community colleges, and start studying screenwriting. Trust me, screenwriting's a lot easier. You make far more money at it, and you get to change the world out there, alone in the dark. Hence corollary number 3, reclaim academe. This is a longer-range proposition. We have had, after all, nearly half a century to completely hollow out the major colleges and universities, especially your so-called Ivy League institutions, largely in the name of our most sacred of sacred cows, the great god diversity. The Ivy League sent a disproportionate number of its sons, no daughters allowed in those benighted old days, off to fight in the Civil War, World War I, and the big one. But after the collapse of the Germany of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and what part of that name sounds like the Reagan Revolution to you, and Imperial Japan, our elite colleges, especially in New England and on the West Coast, became infested with the scions of moral relativism, so that a few short decades after the defeat of socialist fascism in Europe, the children who fled the socialist fascists were suddenly overrepresented among the socialist communists of Harvard, Yale, and Brown students. Viva la Revolución! That's good old America for you. Always willing to extend the olive branch to an enemy, to bend over backward, even at the risk of becoming a prison girlfriend, to the super bright kids, like me, who want to do your country harm. We are nothing if not ungrateful when it suits our purposes. But the weakening economic climate has severely damaged many institutions' endowments, and the end of the echo boom means that fewer middle and upper income kids will be competing for college places in the near future. Colleges will therefore be in the position of being more responsive to their customers. So, stop sending your kids to Harvard, Yale, the University of California, or any other elite university, whether public or private, unless and until they clean up their acts fundamentally. If there's a bigger, more brazen racket in the country than the showcase colleges and universities, I don't know what it is. Sure, they may still be okay for real subjects, like languages and math and science. Although that climate change racket, which we almost got away with, had you going there for a minute. But when it comes to stuff that's either imaginary, the social sciences, useless, English departments, or just plain nuts, pretty much everything else, they are a complete waste of your kids' beer and sex time and your money, which would be around $50,000 a year heading northward in an uninterrupted straight line, especially now that the federal government is going to administer college loans. Hey, Dave, just you wait a minute, Buster. Sending my kid to the Ivy League and beggaring my family not just in this generation, but for future generations to come has been my lifelong dream. Who are you to tell me any different? Bear with me. The reason you don't want to waste upward of $50,000 per annum getting little Johnny, Shaniqua, or Abdul one of those fancy degrees in deconstructionism is that unless you are absolutely certain that your little genius is a liberal, there will be no job waiting for him or her upon graduation.
And that was the next part of Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the next part of Chapter 2 from Don't Think of an Elephant by Dr. George Lakoff.
I first did this, and I'll tell you about the details in a minute. I was asked to give a talk at a linguistics convention. I decided I would talk about this discovery. In the audience were 2 members of the Christian Coalition who were linguists and good friends of mine. Excellent linguists. And very, very good people. Very nice people. People I liked a lot. They took me aside at the party afterward and said, "Well, this strict father model of the family, it's close but not quite right. We'll help you get the details right. However, you should know all this. Have you read Dobson?" I said, "Who?" They said, "James Dobson." I said, "Who?" They said, "You're kidding. He's on 3,000 radio stations." I said, "Well, I don't think he's on NPR. I haven't heard of him." They said, "Well, you live in Berkeley. Where would I... Does he write stuff?" "Oh," they said, "oh, yes. He has sold millions of books. His classic is Dare to Discipline." My friends were right. I followed their directions to my local Christian bookstore, and there I found it all laid out. The strict father model in all its details. Dobson at the time was an influential figure in conservative politics, with a $100 to $200 million a year operation, a widely distributed and read column in newspapers all over America, as well as his own zip code because so many people were writing to order his books and pamphlets. He was effectively teaching people how to use the strict father model to raise their kids. And he understood the connection between strict father families, right-wing politics, evangelical religion, laissez-faire economics, and neoconservative foreign policy. The strict father model begins with a set of assumptions. The world is a dangerous place, and it always will be, because there is evil out there in the world. The world is also difficult because it is competitive. There will always be winners and losers. There is an absolute right and an absolute wrong. Children are born bad in the sense that they just want to do what feels good, not what is right. Therefore, they have to be made good. What is needed in this kind of a world is a strong, strict father who can protect the family in the dangerous world, support the family in the difficult world, and teach his children right from wrong. What is required of the child is obedience, because the strict father is a moral authority who knows right from wrong. It is further assumed that the only way to teach kids obedience, that is, right from wrong, is through punishment, painful punishment when they do wrong. This includes hitting them, and some authors on conservative child rearing recommend sticks, belts, and wooden paddles on the bare bottom. Some authors suggest this start at birth, but Dobson was more liberal. There is no excuse for spanking babies younger than 15 or 18 months of age. Dobson, The New Dare to Discipline, page 65. The rationale behind physical punishment is this. When children do something wrong, if they are physically disciplined, they learn not to do it again. That means they will develop internal discipline to keep themselves from doing wrong, so that in the future they will be obedient and act morally. Without such punishment, the world will go to hell. There will be no morality. Such internal discipline has a secondary effect. It is what is required for success in the difficult competitive world. That is, if people are disciplined and pursue their self-interest in this land of opportunity, they will become prosperous and self-reliant. Thus, the strict father model links morality with prosperity. The same discipline you need to be moral is what allows you to prosper. The link is individual responsibility and the pursuit of self-interest. Given opportunity, individual responsibility, and discipline, pursuing your self-interest should enable you to prosper. Now, Dobson was very clear about the connection between the strict father worldview and free market capitalism. The link is the morality of self-interest, which is the conservative version of Adam Smith's view of capitalism.
And that was second part of Chapter 2, Don't Think of an Elephant, by Dr. George Lakoff. Couple of things. First of all, he's describing something, with Dobson, disciplining your kids. There's nothing wrong with disciplining your kids. I grew up being disciplined. Everybody I knew grew up with this so-called strong father model kind of thing. And actually, most of the time, most of our fathers were at work. So actually, if we were getting disciplined, most of the time, mom was the one that did it. But anyhow, he goes ahead and calls this the strong. He gives it a fancy title. This is the strong father. And then he has the other one, which is the other side, which is lefty Democrat, which is the nurturant parent or the nurturant mother or compassionate mother model. So now you've set up two different models. Why does he do this? Why doesn't he just come out and say, well, the way that the conservatives want to do things is wrong? Simple, because this way, if he does it like this, now he's created a moral equivalency, right? So now the issue becomes popularity. In any moral equivalent situation in which two actions are morally the same, then the only question is, which is more popular? Okay, and that's the way he wants it. Because if he tries to prove that the discipline model, where the father, or the mother for that matter, disciplines the kids, because it is true that kids just want to do whatever feels good. They believe if it feels good, it must be good. And they must learn through their parents that that's not the case. That's why you have your kids eat their vegetables, and very often you're going to have to be firm and discipline them, send them to their room or whatever if they don't eat their vegetables, because they don't like the taste of the vegetables, so it must be bad. No, it's good for you. And having ice cream all the time isn't, even though it tastes good, that kind of thing. So if he has to prove that that's wrong, then now he has a lot of work to do to prove that. And by the way, when we make the presumption for the status quo, what's the status quo? The status quo is the disciplinary model, where parents accept the responsibility of disciplining their children and doing so fairly. And so that's part of the issue here. He wants to make it sound as though there's a vacuum, that there's nothing there, that we're starting from scratch, and that we have two choices. So we can either go with the father model, which is riddled with all kinds of problems, according to him, or we can go with the nurturant mother model, which is flawless, perfect. So that's another reason why he approaches it from this standpoint, rather than saying, okay, this is the way we raise our kids, but there are some improvements that can be made. That's the way we should approach this. We look at the status quo. We're not married to it. We're not wedded to it. Okay, that's what traditionalism is about. Conservatives say that we change when there's an obvious case for change. Okay, and we only change that which we need to change. We don't do wholesale reform. That's for the people that are looking for paradise. We as conservatives know that there is no paradise. There never has been, there isn't now, and the only paradise we're going to have in the future is the second coming of Jesus Christ. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
Similarly, God knew the religious and moral ethic of the pagan world was bad. That's why he established Israel to be a light to all nations. However, by the time Christ arrives on earth, the religious and moral authority in Israel has deviated so far from the original plan that early in Christ's earthly ministry, he gives a message clarifying over 1,000 years of religious teaching and tradition gone awry, which is known as the famous Sermon on the Mount. From that point forward, it is clear to that wayward leadership, Christ represents a threat, so they seek to first discredit him, and when that doesn't work, to kill him instead. They try to discredit him with gotcha questions devised to entrap Jesus into saying something that would either cause the people rallying to him to abandon him or draw the ire of the Roman authorities. Several times Jesus returns fire with a provocative question devised to reveal their true motives. Perhaps the two best examples of this would be: then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Teacher, they said, we know you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by men because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, whose portrait is this and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed, so they left him and went away. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? The son of David, they replied. He said to them, how is it then that David, speaking by the Spirit, calls him Lord? For he says, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If then David calls him Lord, how can he be his son? No one could say a word in reply, and from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. Note when their attempts to discredit Jesus failed, the sellout leaders now turned to the literal kill shot. Better for Christ to die than for all of us to perish, a compromised religious leader named Caiaphas says, foreshadowing the sort of sinister pragmatism we see from all too many contemporary Republicrats, who would rather lose to Democrats than lose control of the GOP to conservatives. Caiaphas is concerned that by Christ challenging the status quo, Christ will expose both he and his peers' hypocrisy, while at the same time upsetting the Roman authorities, prompting a violent backlash. In other words, Caiaphas fears man and not God. Just like the Republicrats of today, who fear the backlash of the liberal media lynch mob more than they fear the God they swore their oaths of office to. If you're a Christian, you know that Christ died for the sins of all humankind, so that through his sacrifice and resurrection, we can be reconciled by grace through faith with our Creator. Therefore, Caiaphas didn't kill Christ any more than the Romans did. We killed Christ every time we disobeyed God. But Caiaphas and the Romans didn't understand that and didn't see the bigger picture. They were operating under the very same myopic and amoral modus operandi the ruling class in our country utilizes today. It's about protecting one's turf, not about doing what's right. Contrast that with Utah Senator Mike Lee responding to snarky political commentators who asked him if the 2013 government shutdown was worth it. He said, quote, it's always worth it to do the right thing. Many of you listening to this already know this, which is why you're reading this book. That's why I didn't write this book to persuade you to follow the vision of our founding fathers. I wrote this book to help those of you who already are reach those among us who are not. Very few Americans are fully invested in a leftist, secular, progressive worldview. In fact, most Americans aren't fully vested in anything. And the left takes advantage of that. With its shallow talking points meant to tickle the ears of the masses, they dumb down in the government schools they control. Therefore, if we're going to swell our ranks with the patriots it will take to restore our republic, we have to reach the uninitiated. Most of those people won't want to believe the bureaucrats and institutions they put their trust in all these years have sold out the country. Yes, they are informed enough to instinctively know something is wrong, and they don't like where the country is headed. But it's tough to go from complacency to conviction in one step.
And that was the next part of Chapter 11 from Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese. And again, there's not much here for the standard rank-and-file Republican, the butcher, baker, candlestick maker. All of this is for office holders and would-be office holders and maybe public speakers and whatnot, such as Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Dad for June the 1st.
June 1st. It's okay to ask for help.
Don't be ashamed to need help. Like a soldier storming a wall, you have a mission to accomplish. And if you've been wounded and you need a comrade to pull you up, so what? Marcus Aurelius.
If your kid was struggling, you'd want them to tell you, right? They didn't understand something in class, you'd want them to ask the teacher. If your neighbor needed something, you wouldn't mind if they mentioned it. If your spouse was overwhelmed and needed a hand, you'd expect them to come to you. Okay, but what about you? Are you okay? More important, are you asking for help when you need it, when you are not okay? Remember, we have to model the behavior we want our kids to learn. So if you refuse to ask for directions when you're obviously lost, what does that tell them? If you refuse to admit you don't know something and you make up an answer to a question instead of looking it up with them, what does that show them about learning and problem solving? Why would they be okay being vulnerable with a doctor or a therapist, with mom or dad, if they have been regularly shown that this is something to be ashamed of? But this is about more than that even. You can't be a good parent if you're hurting and not getting help. You can't be a good parent all by yourself. None of us are islands or invincible or omniscient. To do our best, we have to be able to learn, to rely on others, to admit mistakes, to ask for help. Show them that it is okay to ask for help. Be better for them by asking for the help you know that you need.
And that was The Daily Dad from June the 1st, It's Okay to Ask for Help by Ryan Holiday. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now Bishop Robert Barron.
What else do we see in the cross of Jesus? Not just our sin. We see that sin swallowed up in the ever greater mercy of God. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Jesus takes on all of it. Sin and cruelty, violence, hatred, injustice, all of it. Answers not in kind, answers not with the weapons of the world, but answers rather with God's forgiving love, which can take on all the sin of the world and swallow it up. That's also what we see when we gaze at the cross of Jesus. Our sin, and in itself, that's a very important move. But more to it, our sin conquered.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Ayn Rand thought of the day.
Does each individual set his own standard of morality?
To say that each person sets his own standard would simply mean subjectivity. No, what sets the standards is the science of ethics. That is a branch of philosophy. Its particular task is to define moral standards. Then it is up to each individual to decide what he agrees with, which standards he considers right, if he thinks, which standards he considers rational. Now, an individual may discover a new set of standards, but it is not subjective. It is not just up to him. If he discovers such a subjective code, this is not really morality. It's not ethics. It's just what we call whim worship.
Thank you. And now the 33 Strategies of War, and it's chapter 28. Give your rivals enough rope to hang themselves.
Chapter 28. Give your rivals enough rope to hang themselves. The one-upmanship strategy. Life's greatest dangers often come not from external enemies, but from our supposed colleagues and friends who pretend to work for the common cause while scheming to sabotage us and steal our ideas for their gain. Although in the court in which you serve, you must maintain the appearance of consideration and civility, you also must learn to defeat these people. Work to instill doubts and insecurities in such rivals, getting them to think too much and act defensively. Bait them
with subtle challenges that get under their skin, triggering an overreaction, and embarrassing mistake. The victory you are after is to isolate them, make them hang themselves through their own self-destructive tendencies, leaving you blameless and clean.
And that was the first part of chapter 28, Give Your Rivals Enough Rope to Hang Themselves. And what he's describing basically is what a lot of us go through at work. Every time you go to work and you have the Mr. Comrade, Mr. and Ms. Comrade, the socialist du jour that comes to you in the break room and tries to provoke you. And this is why they try to provoke you, so they can get you isolated. Because if you're provoked into overreacting, then they run to your supervisor and complain. Now you're under more pressure. And then they're going to come in the next time, and they're going to put some more pressure. They're going to start effing with you again because they want to see you suffer. So again, that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about ways to defeat that. And usually one of the best ways to do it in a non-aggressive way is to simply ask questions. What are you talking about? What do you mean? Are you sure? How do you know? Those kinds of things will defeat these folks and keep you out of trouble. Back in a minute.
So what about the Church of England? The Synod recently decided that they would bless same-sex marriage but not celebrate.
I'm an atheist, but I happen to love the Church of England in a weird kind of way.
Did you agree with this decision?
And I understood it, but I thought it was pathetic. The Church sort of has to believe in absolute morality, but it can't and it never has. It thinks it does. It is opposed to relativists like me who say this is sometimes right and sometimes wrong, and there's no absolute good, no absolute evil. And they say nonsense, there's an absolute. But all that, they once believed in slavery, they no longer do. They once believed people like me should be burned in a fire. They no longer do, even if they don't want to marry us. They still, they change their morality every decade.
Thank you. So about Stephen Fry, about this, what I just played from him, it's a scam, of course. And first of all, what he and all other atheists do is they act as though atheism is the status quo. And this is the way they bait you into an argument you can't win. So you got to remember that it is God and godliness, religion, and religious people that are the status quo. Religion and religious people have been around forever, ever since human beings walked the earth. Whether you're going to claim that it's we came up from monkeys or Adam and Eve. There's always been religion and religious people. So religion and religious people are the status quo. That means that the burden of proof is on Stephen Fry and people like Stephen Fry. Okay, they're the ones that have to prove it. Now, the rest of his statement was basically gibberish. He said nothing. The other thing here that's interesting is the interviewer asked him what he thinks about it. This is another trick of the left. The left wants to pretend that everything is a matter of mere opinion. Not a matter of fact, not a matter of right and wrong, but a matter of mere opinion. And that's exactly what Stephen Fry basically did. He said and concluded that everything is a matter of opinion. He claims he's a relativist, which means that you're a person who believes everything is a matter of mere opinion rather than right or wrong or good and bad, true and false, that kind of situation. So he phrased it in that way, again, to steer the conversation in a particular direction. So if he comes out, you're in a situation where somebody says, well, what do you think about X? The best answer to shut them down is to say, my opinion doesn't count. Because that's the case here. He's asking an atheist what they think about something that the Church of England did. His opinion doesn't count. Nobody cares what atheists in general, and Stephen Fry in particular, think about what the Church of England did, or what the Catholic Church does, or the Hinduists do, or whatever.
It is not true, it is false that everything's a matter of opinion. All opinions are equal except as to popularity. That's what they want to get into then, is to try to make you believe that. And they'll ask you, what do you think about this? They'll ask you, what do you think about all kinds of things that you have no control over? You have no, they'll ask you about Ukraine. It's too late for that. My opinion counts politically every 2 years when I go and vote. After that, my opinion no longer counts. Believe it or not, the President of the United States is not going to pick up the phone and call me and say, gee, Ron, what do you think about the situation in Ukraine? What do you think we ought to do? Doesn't matter. My opinion doesn't count. Same thing with the Church of England in this situation with Stephen Fry. The church isn't going to call Stephen Fry and say, hey, we got a bit of a dilemma here. What do you think we ought to do? Okay, they're not going to take a poll or a survey to find out what it is that they should do. They're going to do what they know is right. Now, as far as the rest of it, too, by the way, says, well, they change their mind every 10 years. Not true. A lot of people that are relativists like to use the flat earth as an example. Well, we used to believe that it was a flat earth. No, we knew that the earth was flat until we knew better. And that's the way things work. There's no vacuum. There's no vacuum when it comes to knowledge. You know what you know until you know better. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, since we've gone through the enemies of my country, and that one's finished, I'm going to pick up with the 10 books every conservative must read by Dr. Benjamin-Wiker.
Chapter 1. The Politics, Aristotle. Man is by nature a political animal. Aristotle, the father of political conservatism. Calling Aristotle the father of political conservatism should give conservatives a feeling of great relief. Conservatism is much older than America. It is not a modern invention. It goes back far earlier and far deeper, and that gives it a far firmer foundation and an even grander pedigree, stretching to ancient Greece. Conservatism is a perennial political philosophy, and its founding text is Aristotle's Politics. Aristotle is the father of political conservatism in two important related senses. First, he understood that the decisive political argument occurs between those who maintain, as he did, that political life and morality are natural, and those who assert that political life and morality are entirely man-made, as did the sophists and political innovators of his day. This argument is still with us. As we'll see, it marks the crucial difference between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives tend toward political caution because they believe man is not infinitely malleable, and they believe that morality is objective and puts limits on what human beings can and should do. Liberals tend to believe the reverse, that morality is relative, and that man is malleable and can rightfully be subject to political manipulation to advance some heady notion of the common good or expedite some grand progressive project. Conservatives, like Aristotle, prefer experience to theory. In fact, conservatives cringe at utopian philosophical schemes, which liberals tend to embrace because they vivify or justify their efforts at social engineering. And, like Aristotle, conservatives generally accept the world as it is. They distrust the politics of abstract reason, that is, reason divorced from experience. Liberals see no problem with reconstituting a nation's political life on the basis of some attractive but untried rational scheme used as a tempting template to draw up programs of hope and change. But while the conservative disposition, which we can trace to Aristotle, is suspicious of abstract reason, it is not obviously hostile to philosophy. Aristotle remains, after all, one of the handful of great philosophers in human history, and history has preserved only a portion of his works, which range widely from detailed biological treatises, such as The Parts of Animals and The Generation of Animals, an examination of the soul, works on respiration and youth and old age, to his seminal works on logic and language. such as the Categories and On Interpretation, more general treatises on nature like the Physics and On the Heavens, books on rhetoric and poetics, an exposition of the principles of ethics, and the most abstract principles of metaphysics. Conservatives aren't anti-intellectual. They simply and solidly demand that our reason be firmly tethered to our experience of reality as it is. So for conservatives, like Aristotle, the practice of philosophy, the seeking of wisdom, involves the study of things as they are, not as we might like them to be, and that includes the study of human beings and political life. That is why Aristotle asserted that young men aren't good hearers of lectures on politics. They don't have enough actual experience of human nature and political life, and since they're passionate, they're prone to passionate and destructive schemes for overhauling society. A short overview of Aristotle's life reveals that, for him, experience and philosophy went together. Aristotle, the man of wisdom and experience. Aristotle was born in Stagira in Greece in 384 BC. His father, Nicomachus, was the court physician and advisor to the Macedonian king Amyntas III. Amyntas was the father of Philip II, and Philip II was the father of Alexander III, better known as Alexander the Great. All these kings were active in the perpetual wars boiling up the Greek peninsula, and all, especially Alexander, pushed the conquering reach of Macedon beyond its borders. Alexander was born in 356 BC, and when he turned 13, Aristotle, almost 30 years his senior, became his tutor, and as a reward for his efforts, got Alexander's father Philip to rebuild Stagira, one of the many towns the king had beaten to dust. As Alexander was an heir to conquest, Aristotle was an heir to philosophy, and he had brought those riches with him, on a rather roundabout route, to the royal court of Macedon. He was the third of three great philosophers, certainly the three greatest that ever lived: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle himself. At 17, Aristotle had traveled from Macedonia to Athens, from a nascent empire to one of the numerous independent city-states of the Greek peninsula, the city where Socrates, about 30 years earlier, had been sentenced to death for allegedly corrupting the young with his ideas. Aristotle enrolled in the academy, a school started by Socrates' best pupil, Plato, and studied and taught with Plato for some 20 years, leaving Athens only after Plato's death in 347 BC. Aristotle then emigrated to Asia Minor, where he married Pythias, the adopted daughter of Hermias, a former slave who had become the despotic ruler of the city of Atarneus. Aristotle's influence is credited with moderating and tempering Hermias's tyranny, for Hermias, too, had studied philosophy with Plato and even with Aristotle himself, and would accept much of what Aristotle had to say as the better part of wisdom. Aristotle even arranged an alliance between Hermias and Philip of Macedon. That turned to ashes, however, when Hermias was kidnapped by a Persian ally, clapped in chains, and tortured to reveal Philip's plans for the invasion of Asia Minor. He refused to betray his friends and died in 341 BC. Before Hermias met his death, Aristotle had traveled to Lesbos, an island in the northeastern Aegean, where he had gone to study biology. His method there was typical of the man. He did not sit on a rock by the sea and dream up grand theories of the universe and the origin and destiny of life, but got down in the water and looked for himself at what living things actually did, cut them up to see what they were really made of, and looked to experienced fishermen rather than philosophers to learn about the details of sea life. It was in 342 that Philip called Aristotle to Macedon to become a tutor to young Alexander and other important Macedonian nobles, and it seems that Aristotle's influence carried all the way into Philip's own policies, especially encouraging leniency toward Athens. After Philip was assassinated in 336, his son Alexander was proclaimed king by the Macedonian army. He was only 20. Aristotle left for Athens and remained there for nearly the rest of his life. Over the next decade, while Alexander was conquering Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, Persia, and stretching towards India, Aristotle was in Athens philosophizing, starting his own school, the Lyceum. Most of the works we have from him come from this period. When Alexander the Great died in 323 from poison, malaria, typhoid fever, pancreatitis, overeating the medical plant hellebore, heavy drinking, or complications from a previous wound, you can take your pick, the immediate result was predictable. With the removal of the heavy hand of Macedonian rule, Athens rebelled, and Aristotle, the royal intimate of Macedonian kings, came under charges of impiety at Athens, the very same kind of charge that brought the Athenians to serve hemlock to Socrates 3/4 of a century earlier. Aristotle fled to the Chalcis, a Macedonian stronghold on the island of Euboea, his mother's native soil, where he died in 322. Aristotle's Politics, written while he was in Athens teaching at the Lyceum, is an expansive treatise, and it rests firmly upon his formidable intellect and his deep and long experience of political life. Unfortunately, we cannot possibly cover the entire argument of the Politics in a single summary chapter. By unearthing some of its riches, I hope I can induce readers to do further digging on their own. But it is important to remember that when Aristotle wrote about politics, he did so as someone who had been at the very center of political intrigue and jostling empires. His starting point is neither utopian, dreaming up airy schemes about the way things ought to be, nor does he take the snake's eye view of realpolitik, later made famous by Machiavelli. Instead, Aristotle begins where political life begins, in the natural moral order of human life, and ends where it ought to end, in making us better than we were, even though we fall far short of the angels. The natural foundation of political life. Aristotle opens the Politics with an argument implicitly but firmly defined against the sophists, the smart-set moral relativists, the liberals of ancient Greece. The sophists argued that all moral standards are merely artificial, conventional, and relative to the political power structures of society. Against this claim, Aristotle, without ever mentioning sophism by name, an important strategy as it turns out, makes bold to say that the starting point of society is the natural union of male and female. It is the family. From several households arise a village, and from the union of several villages, the city. The family, and by extension the city, belongs among the things that exist by nature. And from that we can conclude that man is by nature a political animal. We are naturally social, and so we are naturally political. And politics, rightly understood, is not about power, but about acting out and perfecting our human nature insofar as it is possible. That last proviso keeps Aristotle from being a dangerous utopian, even while it sets a moral standard that pushes us upward. For Aristotle, size is important. The goal of perfecting our human nature means that political life has to fit our nature. A village is too small, a nation is too large. A city, not a sprawling metropolis made of concrete, but a small city surrounded by an agricultural belt, is just right. Why is a city just the right size? A village can provide the necessities of life, but it isn't big enough to allow for the full flowering of our nature, which spills over into art, architecture, theater, music, literature, science, and philosophy. But a nation is too large, too unwieldy and bloated, too filled with vices, too subject to foreign influences. Citizens are too disconnected in a large nation. It is local affection that binds men together naturally. It is knowing our neighbors and their character that makes self-government possible. With Aristotle, we find the conservative disposition that prefers the local to the national and distrusts centralism and bureaucracy. Aristotle also denies the sophistic and liberal idea that society is simply an arrangement, a contract, an agreement among individuals. On the contrary, society is not a contract or agreement, but arises naturally. It rests not on atomistic individuals, but on the basic building block of the family. He means this quite literally. The sexual desire for reproduction defines us as naturally, fundamentally social. We desire children to create our own natural society. Contra Hillary Clinton, it doesn't take a village to raise a child, or a state pretending to be a village. It takes a father and mother. The children who come from this most natural of unions go on to marry and have children themselves, and help to create a village. As the family trees of the village branch out over time, the village becomes a city. Such is the natural unfolding of human society. Society doesn't rest on some kind of social contract that guarantees abstract rights, but on the natural union of husband and wife that binds the past and present to the future with children. So-called family values conservatism didn't begin with modern evangelicals, and it isn't just one stream of conservative thought. To Aristotle, it would have been the very definition of conservatism, or of politics properly understood and practiced, because the family is the real, incontrovertible, natural origin of society. This connects directly with another conservative concern, morality. Aristotle argues that morality is not a set of artificial and arbitrary rules, but arises from our natural beginning, and so it too is natural. The moral order is there to greet us when we are born. It is present in the natural, moral order of the family, the first society that any of us ever know. And it is in the family, says Aristotle, that we learn the natural moral law that sets the standard for civil justice. The well-ordered family is a kind of miniature city, or more exactly, a well-ordered society in seed form. In Aristotle's view, legal codes and political schemes should be judged by whether they adhere to or deviate from this natural moral order. But here we must insert a most emphatic note of caution. While the family is the natural origin of society, that does not mean that the city is just one big happy family. The family and the city are distinct and relate as an integral part to a whole that completes it. The whole does not replace the integral part. The city does not replace the family. Aristotle would rightly be horrified at the modern liberal tendency, present in both Marxism and liberal progressivism, to disintegrate the natural family and contrive to make the state some kind of superfamily in its place. Another note of caution. Aristotle, of course, does not say that all families are well ordered. The family is natural, but the good ordering of the family is not automatic. Just as a garden needs to be well cared for, so does a family. Just as plants need to be pruned, so families need to be pruned of vice, which otherwise distorts their growth. The disordered souls of a father and mother can lead to disordered families, which lead to disordered societies. Bad morality often comes from badly ordered families. The process accelerates when a disordered society reaches back into the family and twists its natural order into unnatural shapes, making the family a morbid, distorted reflection of what it should be. So, just as there are good and bad families, there are good and bad governments, a point we'll get to in a minute. But first we have to deal with the most important objections to Aristotle's starting point. The hard bits of Aristotle's argument. Liberals will be quick to remind us that Aristotle also believed that slavery was natural, and that the familial and political subordination of women was natural. Some liberals might say that what they support is not moral relativism, but liberation from unjust traditions upheld by conservatives like Aristotle. But this is to miss a very important point about true conservatism. It is tied to particular principles, not inextricably bound to a particular man or book or particular political order. Aristotle believed, as true conservatives do, that the wisdom gained from experience should be our guide. And so, if we err, we can and must amend our views, just as Aristotle corrected what he thought were errors in the thought of Plato. Conservatism is not blind acceptance, but careful consideration, and that includes reconsideration. Aristotle wrongly believed that slavery is natural. He was wrong about other things as well. He believed that the law should allow, even demand, the killing by exposure of deformed children, that the state should determine the number of children parents may have, and that those children conceived beyond this number should be aborted in the first trimester. We can reject all these things as wrong if and only if we believe that it is possible to be right. That is, only if we assume, with Aristotle and against ancient sophists and modern moral relativists, there is an objective moral order that we can know and follow. We must also point out for the record that it was Christianity that historically allowed for the correction of Aristotle in regard to slavery, as well as abortion and infanticide. With all that said, let's look more carefully at Aristotle's discussion of women and slaves, for even among errors here, there are insights. Aristotle says that the female is distinguished by nature from the slave. The barbarians, though, regard the female and slave to be of the same order. In short, Aristotle marks a barbarian as barbarous precisely in his use of the female as a slave. This is not a small point, as any honest anthropologist will reveal. In a large majority of primitive cultures, precisely those that didn't own slaves, women performed a great portion of the backbreaking menial tasks that must be done for any society to survive. It follows, perhaps somewhat uncomfortably, that historically, the first emancipation of women came with the institution of slavery. Or, to put the same point in a broader context, the societies in which women had the most leisure and political power were those where upper-class women depended on lower-class or slave laborers of both sexes. So, Aristotle did not see women as slaves. He asserted that only barbarians did. Therefore, he did not see the relationship of husband and wife, or parents and children, in terms of master and slave. Instead, he uses overtly political terms. He compares the man's governing of a household to political rule. The just man is no despot over his family. Rather, he rules his wife and children as free persons, though it is not the same mode of rule in each case, the wife being ruled in a political way and the children in kingly fashion. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle remarks that the kind of friendship that unites husband to wife is aristocratic, and the father's friendship toward his children should be kingly. This political language might strike us as quite odd, but it allows Aristotle to avoid being conservative in the worst distorted sense, defending the family by defending tyrannical husbands and fathers. Here, as everywhere, Aristotle distinguishes between good and bad, just and unjust. Because Aristotle uses specifically political terms to make that distinction, we need to move beyond the family and look at Aristotle's account of political regimes. Good and bad political regimes. At the heart of Aristotle's politics is the division of political regimes into different types. We are accustomed to thinking that political regimes can be divided into two kinds, democracy and everything else. Democracy is good and everything else is bad. But that is not Aristotle's way of dividing things at all. According to Aristotle, political regimes may be divided according to the number who rule and what kind of rule, good or bad. This allows for a sixfold division of good and bad regimes. If one person rules for the true common good, it is kingly rule. If one person rules only for his own advantage, the regime is a tyranny. If a few rule for the true common good, it is an aristocracy. If the few rule only for their own advantage, it is an oligarchy. And here comes a great shock. If the many, the majority, rule for the sake of the true common good, the regime is called a polity. If the many, the majority, rule for their own private advantage rather than the common good, the regime is a democracy. A bit disconcerting, isn't it? We tend to regard democracy as the only good regime, and every other form of government we brand indifferently as a tyranny. That is, we regard majority rule as sacred and good in itself, and every other form of government as a perversion. But Aristotle takes the quite sensible position that the majority can be as selfish, foolish, and tyrannical as any tyrant or oligarch. Therefore, he calls democracy a perversion. It is a perversion of the good form of rule by the many, a polity, from which we get the term political. It is of no small historical consequence that when the Romans wanted to translate Greek political thought into Roman terms, the great Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero translated the Greek word politeia, polity, using the Latin term res publica. Our Latin-based equivalent is republic, as in, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. For our purposes, we can use either term, polity or the more familiar republic, as more or less synonymous. Before we jump to any conclusions, we had better look more carefully at Aristotle's argument and try to understand it on its own terms. First and foremost, the difference between the good and bad regimes is obviously not how many rule, but for what. Kings, aristocrats, and the many rulers of the polity, or republic, govern for the sake of the true human good of their subjects, and that includes especially their moral good. For Aristotle, the perfection of our nature, the development of virtuous citizens, is our moral good. Tyrants, oligarchs, and democrats rule for their own private advantage. They serve only their own wants and characteristically indulge in every vice that political power can purchase. In applying this to family life, Aristotle says that a husband and father rules his family and household either for the sake of the ruled or for the sake of something common to both, the common good of the family. The relationship of the husband to his wife is properly aristocratic, by which Aristotle means that the man rules according to his worth and about things which it is necessary for the man to rule, and he commits to his wife to rule as her due, those things for which she is well fit. The perversion of this is when the husband rules his wife as an oligarch and controls everything for his own advantage. Similarly, if a man rules his children merely for his own advantage, he is a tyrant and not a kingly father. Turning back to the political realm again, for Aristotle, it is better to live under a good king than in a democracy or oligarchy, or in a good republic rather than under a tyrant. In short, any good form is better than any bad form. But even here, among the good forms, there is a kind of ranking, for if there were one person preeminent in virtue, a man of supreme goodness, it would be good for everyone to obey such a person gladly. Aristotle does not say that we should abolish every bad form of government and replace it with a good one. For Aristotle, prudence is the wisdom of politics, and to be prudent means that you can't snap a bent board straight without breaking the board. That is destruction, not reform. Instead, you take what you actually find and you work to make it better. There is a very good reason for this cautious approach. True kingships, aristocracies, and republics are rare because true virtue is rare, either among the rulers or the ruled. Human wickedness is all too prevalent, and that means that we are far more likely to find, as political material to work with, tyrannies posing as kingships, oligarchies posing as aristocracies, and democracies posing as republics. The reality of wickedness, or sin, makes the creation of perfect political regimes humanly impossible, and it ensures that any imprudent attempts to create political perfection, or utopia, will end in disaster. Conservatives believe in original sin, or the simple reality of human wickedness, and understand that this limits what good politics can achieve. Aristotle spends far more time on the bad regimes than the good, because we're far more likely to be faced with bad regimes than good ones. Therefore, we will focus primarily, as he does, on oligarchy and democracy. The oligarch and the democrat. According to Aristotle, neither oligarchy nor democracy is entirely unjust. Indeed, each has hold of a kind of half-truth about justice. Both fasten onto a certain sort of justice, but proceed only to a certain point. The oligarchs grab onto one aspect of justice, inequality. Those who work harder should receive a greater reward. Those who run faster should receive the prize. Those who contribute more to the political regime should have more privileges and honor. Those who have more money, and who therefore provide more support for the regime, should have more power and prestige. The Democrats seize another aspect of political justice, equality. Since all are equally citizens, they believe that all should be treated equally in every way. But two half-truths about justice do not make a whole truth. Aristotle tells us that almost all men are bad judges concerning their own things. Our biases warp our understanding. Oligarchs think that because they have far more money, they are superior in all things, and justice should focus entirely on inequality. Democrats think that because they are equally free citizens with the oligarchs, they should be equal in all things. They therefore focus on freedom and equality as if they were moral absolutes. At the heart of this disagreement is money, or more accurately, wealth. It is the division between the few rich and the many poor, and it represents a kind of permanent historical tension. Aristotle points out that the way to blunt this tension is through the creation of something in between rich and poor. So he remarks, in all cities there are three parts of the city, the very well off, the very poor, and third, those in the middle between these. This middling element, the middle class, is the key. A society with a dominant middle class is where a lasting polity is capable of existing. The stability provided by a dominant middle class is not just a matter of money, but even more, a matter of character. The middle class works hard. Like the rich, the middle class believes hard work should be rewarded. Since middle-class people own property, they stand ready to defend property rights and block burdensome taxation against the efforts of the property-less poor who want property and wealth redistributed equally. But like the poor, the middle class believes in political equality. The middle class does not believe that the rich are inherently more virtuous or better qualified to hold political power than anyone else. In his attention to the character of the middle class, Aristotle argues that farmers make the strongest foundation for a solid middle class, and the best foundation for a polity or republic, because they are hard-working, independent, and self-reliant. And we are not surprised that, according to Aristotle, the best legislators are from the middling citizens. Their character makes them govern most wisely and moderately, at least more so than the very rich or the very poor. The American Republic, obviously, has followed Aristotle's advice, and even today our two major political parties reflect aspects of his argument, especially in how they characterize each other. Democrats cast the Republicans as the oligarchs, the party of the rich who rule only for the benefit of the rich. Republicans cast Democrats as the party of the grasping poor, whose policies entail high taxes and socialism, i.e. enforced equality in all respects. And interestingly enough, both parties profess themselves to be the party of the middle class. The middle class itself, however, seems to have growing doubts about whether either party is interested in ruling virtuously and for the common good. How to destroy a republic. If the middle class is the strength of a republic is nevertheless easily destroyed, as Aristotle makes dolefully but prudently clear. The delicate balance between rich and poor can be toppled. Self-interest can trump the common good. The austerity of moral virtue can be traded for soft comfort and pleasure. Such revolutions come from small beginnings, from factions at odds with the political order. Here, too, is a great conservative point. No political regime, no political order is exempt from corruption. If the characters of the people fail, the regime will split at the seams and unravel. For Aristotle, the greatest factional split is perhaps that between virtue and depravity. Morality is the great cement that holds a regime together. But when war is waged on morality, when depravity comes to blows with virtue and gains the upper hand, then a good government can quickly become a bad one. On these grounds, so-called moral issues are the fundamental ones. Next comes the economic split between wealth and poverty, between rich and poor, oligarch and democrat. A regime can be torn apart from the side of the poor. A democratic revolution occurs, particularly on account of the wanton behavior of the popular leaders, who, on behalf of the poor, harass those owning property and egg on the multitude against them and slander the wealthy in order to be in a position to confiscate their goods. Even more ominous, the demagogues, in order to make themselves popular, so they can get elected, assert that the will of the people is supreme over the law, or in American political terms, that popular political projects can override the Constitution. Democrats certainly seem to have something of the truth in defining justice in terms of political freedom and equality. But Aristotle notes they define freedom badly, for there are two things by which democracy is held to be defined, the majority having authority and freedom. But here, things start to go badly. While justice is rightly held to be something equal, the majority come to believe that political equality requires that whatever the multitude resolves is authoritative, and freedom and equality involve doing whatever one wants. The result is that everyone lives as he wants, and toward whatever end he happens to crave. Liberty, the right to be a free man, then becomes license, the right to be an immoral man, and justice is defined as having an equal right to do whatever we want. The desire to do whatever we want, and the premium on tolerating everyone living as he wants, leads to a situation not much different from tyranny, because the demagogues create something akin to tolerance police to enforce political correctness. Women are encouraged to inform on men, slaves are set against their masters, and the self-flattering majority against the independent-minded. Moreover, the Democrats, in order to enhance their power of numbers over the oligarchs, add as many persons as possible who were previously excluded as citizens, including people who were previously classified as resident aliens. If Aristotle is no friend of egalitarian democracy, he also maintains that the aggrandizements of the wealthy are more ruinous to the polity than those of the people. So, he is no friend of oligarchy either. The rich can do a lot of damage precisely because they are rich, and they can buy a revolution in government. Just like the Democrats, they can rule tyrannically when they rule by their will, rather than according to the law. This is especially a problem with elections of public officials, where moneyed interests more easily gain public offices. Oligarchies are unstable governments because the wealthy are inevitably divided into factions, with the factions appealing to the masses against each other, but with each faction just as self-interested as the last. Another kind of revolution occurs when the oligarchs expend their private wealth in wanton living. As with Democrats who exchanged liberty for license, dissipated oligarchs invite a takeover by a tyrant, or a rebellion of the frustrated and disgusted many who realize the oligarchs are not fit to share in rule. Sound familiar in any way? Reading Aristotle today, he can seem like a political prophet, a conservative who foresaw many of our current political problems. But it is important to remember that Aristotle's seemingly prophetic powers were the result of his being conservative in another all-important sense. He conserved the political lessons of history. Looking backwards gave him the wisdom to look forward. Human beings are remarkably and lamentably all too predictable. Political animal or political beast? We headed this chapter with Aristotle's famous statement that man is by nature a political animal. We end it with a warning that every conservative should take to heart. The city allows for the development of the full human life that begins in the family, and so Aristotle asserts that the first person who set up the city is responsible for the greatest of goods. But then he makes us aware of a fundamental ambiguity. For just as man is the best of animals when perfected, when separated from law and justice, he is the worst of all. For injustice is harshest when it is furnished with arms, and man is born naturally possessing arms for the use of prudence and virtue, which are nevertheless very susceptible to being used for their opposites. This is why, without virtue, he is the most unholy and the most savage of the animals, and the worst in regard to sex and food. This ambiguity, that the best of animals may all too easily become the most savage, isn't addressed only to some alleged savage man against the civilized. It is addressed most of all to the civilized man as a warning. For it is precisely in civilization that we find those who, spurning virtue, will use all the developments and advantages of political life and political power for the enjoyment of the most degrading vices. Without attention to virtue, without care for a regime's moral foundation, the most savage men will soon enough rule, and we will be changed from political animals to political beasts.
And that was Chapter 1 of the 10 books every conservative must read, plus 4 not to miss and 1 imposter by Benjamin-Wiker, Ph.D.,
And let's see if I can figure out who it is that was who is reading this. I can't make out the name. Let me see if I can do this. No, that doesn't work either. But it's obviously the same guy that was reading the book that I finished not too long ago about the unit, about Delta Force. So, next time, Chapter 2. Back in a minute. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.